Can everybody hear me okay now?
Yes.
Well, that's good. Um, so I'll start by saying a few things. Most importantly, my name is Andrew Schneider, and I am the executive director of the Columbia Pike Partnership. I'm very familiar with ANV. I've been familiar with it for many years, going back to even before Wendy started. I'm a big fan of Wendy's, and I worked with her more closely when I was the executive director of Arlington Thrive, previously Amen, which I was the executive director of 26 from 2016 to 2022, or beginning of 2023. I am not surprised because they are busy people, but I was hoping to see Dave Christian or Mary Beth Chambers on here because those are also pals of mine from way back, having grown up in Arlington and being a lifelong or nearly lifelong Arlington resident. See a few names that I recognize. Cheryl, of course, I know from our time together at WERA, and I know that you were a guest on my show at least once, and I remember that fondly. Um, I have lived in Arlington most of my life. I grew up near Overley Pool, over in the Terraleeway Heights neighborhood. I've most recently been living in the East Falls Church neighborhood. I spent some time in about 15 years in the Yorktown Civic Association, and most recently I've moved to Arlington Forest. I'm creeping closer and closer to Arlington Pike, Columbia Pike in South Arlington. I'm not there yet. I'm easing into it. Um, I have two children, a son at the University of Tennessee and a daughter at my alma mater, William and Mary. She's a freshman. Um, and my parents still live in the home that I grew up in over on 22nd Street near Westover. Uh, so that's a little bit about me. I will also say that I was the Civic Association president for the Yorktown Civic Association for about 8 or 9 years, and I ran for county board in 2015 against Christian Dorsey and Katie Crystal in Democratic primary, and against Rip Sullivan for the General Assembly in 2014. If you've heard of me, that might be the reason why. And if you haven't heard of me, that might be the reason why I lost. Um, so um, Next time you'll remember, but there probably won't be a next time. Nonetheless, that's me. I'm just trying to think about anything else about me that would be of just scintillating interest. I did go to preschool, or my kids went to preschool in the same church that I believe ANV has its, or Arlington Neighborhood Villages has its offices, although they are now um, gone away. I went to the same preschool, Overly Cooperative Preschool, but that was in the 70s. So that's me. And I don't think I will go all the way to 1050, but then again, people who have handed me the mic before have been proven wrong in the past, so we will see how we do. I've been asked to talk a little bit about Columbia Pike and the Columbia Pike Partnership, and because I don't have slides, I'll have to do my best to keep this interesting and dynamic, and maybe even modulate my voice at times to make sure nobody falls asleep. For those of you who are not on camera, I consider that an unfair advantage, but I will be using the folks on camera as my focus group or out of focus group. So Columbia Pike and the Columbia Pike Partnership is a distinct part of our community. If you are not familiar with it, you are not alone. But if you are familiar with it, you will feel many of the things that I talk about when I talk about it. I I was attracted to the job because it was a piece of Arlington that I didn't know that much about. And after having been here for so many years, I felt like I had some of the skills that I believed both the partnership and the corridor needed. Before I tell you too much about the partnership, let me just tell you a little bit about the Columbia Pike Corridor and how it fits into the greater Arlington community. And I'm not going to poll everybody, but for those of you who live on the Pike, you'll be like, yeah, 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 we know this. And for the people who don't live on the Pike, you'll be like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. So I'm going to assume that most of you, because most Arlingtons don't live on the Pike. The Columbia Pike Corridor is a 3.1 mile long corridor in Arlington, stemming all the way from Bailey's Crossroad all the way to the Pentagon and the Air Force Memorial. It is comprised of 10 civic associations that are both on the north and the south sides of Columbia Pike. Some of them are the largest, very large, like Douglas Park, and some of them are very small, like Foxcroft Heights. But all in, the Columbia Pike corridor has about 40,000 residents, which is about 16 to 18% of the county's population. What One of my favorite facts about the Pike, even before I talk about other demographics, is that we have about 25% of APS's student population. So we have about 150% overrepresentation of students vis-a-vis the general population. As I like to say when I'm giving more fund-seeking talks, is that the future of Arlington lives on the Pike, right? So we have so many kids that live on or off the Pike. The other interesting thing about the Pike is what it is comprised of. It is the least economically well-off part of Arlington. We have a median income of about $100,000. I've seen both 99 and I've seen about 100, so it's right around $100,000. The median income for Arlington overall, I believe, is about 120,000, and in '05 and '07, it's over 150,000. So you can see that the disparity is quite great. Part of that is just driven by the housing stock. We have a very diverse housing stock in terms of affordability. It's one of the last places in Arlington where there's what we call market rate affordable housing. And we are the largest concentration of committed affordable housing, about a third of all committed, meaning that it will always be affordable housing, even as other things either gentrify or get redone or redeveloped, that there will be 30% of all the affordable housing right now is in Arlington, which represents about 20 to 25% of all of the housing in that Columbia Pike corridor. And that's from places like True Ground or APA, AHC, Wesley Housing, places like that. And maybe this goes hand in hand, or maybe it's a totally different variable. It is the most diverse part of Arlington. It is a majority white corridor, majority non-white corridor, with about 60% of the Pike population being non-white. That is by far and away the most diverse part of Arlington. In fact, we like to say that the reason why Arlington can say we are a diverse and welcoming community is because of what is happening on the Pike. The other interesting thing, before I talk about any other things in comparison, is that we are very low in our commercial density. You may know some small businesses or restaurants that you've been to: Bangkok 54, Sabora's, William Jeffrey Tavern, Thai Square. There's some really well-known restaurants on the Pike, but there is hardly any office space on the Pike. And in some ways, that's great, right? So we don't have like Roslyn or National Landing, 25% office vacancy. In fact, we have very low commercial vacancy on the Pike. So the things that plague other parts of the county are not plaguing Columbia Pike or the Columbia Pike corridor. I think if it's cool, Greg, I'm happy to stop and just ask any kind of demographic, population-specific questions before I go into a little bit about Columbia Pike partnership and the things that we do, and then a little bit more about what I'm thinking about for the future. Any questions on that?
Well, I was going
Yeah.
to ask, the Arlington has a fairly large Ethiopian community. How much of that
Mhm.
is right there on the pike?
Well, my understanding is, and I think one of the challenges is that when people report census data, which is usually the best way to do it, is that they're not reporting it by country, right? They're reporting it by I think it's by African descent or some version of that. What I'll say, it's somewhat similar to what's happened in Clarendon, right? That as the Ethiopian diaspora grew and became more affluent and more ingrained in the community, that a lot of it has spread out. So the largest Ethiopian concentrations are further out in Annandale. When I was growing up, there was a large concentration still in Bailey's Crossroad, and then also Silver Spring, Maryland. There's not a large concentration of residents on Columbia Pike, but there are still several well-known Ethiopian businesses, and obviously ECDC, which is a very well-known national refugee resettlement and support agency, was founded on the Pike and still owns two large parcels on the Pike. So that's that. And then I thought there was a question in the chat, and then Steve has a question. So Steve, I'll call you first. Just
Did you hear me okay?
Yeah.
A long time ago, maybe 10 or 15 years, I used to help a group of Mongolian immigrants help with produce a television show called uh, I forget the name of it, but anyway, they've since moved to Falls Church, but not Falls Church, but Fairfax to produce their television show. But one day I was walking around in Arlington Independent Media, and they were uh, gathering uh, equipment for you know, production outside of the studio. And I said, "Oh, what are you guys doing?" They said, "We're going to do some man on the street interviews." And I said, "Oh, you're going to come up to people on the street and hope they're Mongolian?" And they said, "Well, no." Well, and of course, I put my foot in my mouth when I did that, when I said that. Turns out there's a huge Mongolian community that is just south of Columbia Pike along Courthouse Road. So I thought that might be of interest to everybody, that there is a huge Mongolian community there on Columbia Pike.
There is, and I would say, and I don't want to muddle my messages here, but I would say one of the communities that I've had a hardest time making inroads to is the Mongolian community. It's very insular. There's a very significant language barrier, and I think there are a few properties where there are quite a few there's concentrations of Mongolians on the Pike. Um, and again, they've also, because that those influxes of immigrants has waned over the years and is these patterns kind of, this is not my area of expertise, but it's just things that I've noticed just anecdotally. So, but yes, I think that is one of the things that is really special about the Pike, that a lot of communities have kind of um, at least began their story on the Pike, for all the reasons why I said, the affordability, um, the welcomeness, the ability to kind of get started there, the schools, things like that. So it could have been, I will just put it in the chat, it could have been part of the Columbia Pike documentary project, which is here on this little link that I've just put in the chat, which is a very neat project that's been supported not only by the Columbia Pike Partnership, but then also by Arlington County and donors and things like that. And then the question in the chat, let's just get to that. Do you have an idea of how many different property owners are represented? Right. It's not, when I was the Civic Association president of the Yorktown Civic Association, I said, I'm going to do this job with the sole purpose of redeveloping the Garden City strip mall, which is right there with Caribbean Chicken and Shanghai Chinese restaurant, if you remember that far back, or um, there was an arcade there back in the 90s, all of those things. But it turns out there are 13 owners in that 16 business property, and I think that will be the last parcel redeveloped on Langston Boulevard because of that. I mean, so we have some of that on the Pike. What we don't have as much of is multi-owner parcels where people have to get a lot of different people agreeing to it. What we have on the Pike, though, is we have some very large landowners like Lola Reinch and Reinch and Co. owns 4 apartment buildings. BM Smith owns 4 or 5 apartment buildings. The Fillmore Gardens apartment is owned by the Burka family, and they own 500 garden style apartments right off of the Pike. So there are some large landowners, and then there's a lot of smaller commercial owners. I have found it to be a lot less elusive than I did in other parts of Arlington. I think it's relatively straightforward. I do not know how many there are. I do know, and also what I'm trying to figure out, and I'll talk about this a little bit when I talk about CPP more, is where do I consider my areas of focus? Because 3.1 miles is a lot of area to cover. So I'll talk about that in a second. But I would not say of all the hindrances that we have on the Pike in terms of redevelopment have been related to that. I'd say it's more making sure the cost of redevelopment, especially in Arlington County, is worth the benefit. Because it's a lower cost area, it means that you can't charge $3,000 for a 1 bedroom. It means you can charge $2,000. Well, that means that's gonna, if you're building out your model on what it costs to build something, and the costs are essentially the same. How do you put in a project that makes sense for you as a developer and as a property owner? What is going to incentivize you to redevelop when you are making money, or your family's making money, your heirs or whomever are making money on the current lease or use of the property? So that's a constant struggle. And we'll talk about that. Let me not get too far down that, because I could go down on that for a while. Let me tell you a little bit about both Columbia Pike Partnership and some of the ways that Columbia Pike is redeveloped. So the Columbia Pike Partnership was originally founded in 1986 as the Columbia Pike Revitalization Organization, CPRO. Maybe you heard about it, maybe you haven't, but it was really funded with county funds, always from the beginning, to support revitalization and redevelopment along the Pike. And it was civic and community led, with this distinct purposes, like, and many of you may have been involved with these efforts in other places, getting neighborhood plans written, approved, and implemented across the whole Pike corridor. And they were successful. There was a few different plans that were passed in the late 90s and early 2000s. They were the Columbia Pike Master Plan, the Columbia Pike Form-Based Code, which I'll talk about in a second, and then the neighborhood form-based, commercial form-based code, and then the neighborhood form-based code. All of those were developed in order to make it easier for redevelopment to happen. So basically, if you want to build something and you ascribe to the structure of the form-based code, you don't have to go through the same arduous process that somebody in another part of the county would have to do. Also, if you build on Columbia Pike and redevelop on Columbia Pike, some of the requirements that are part of housing or redevelopment in other parts of the county do not apply. So you have to, hey, there he is. Okay, thank you. Now I'm getting a fact checker, which is making me a lot more nervous. I'm just making up most of this presentation. And you can help us with the dates. But anyways, the form-based code has inspired a lot of redevelopment. When you look, and I'll share this in a minute, on the Arlington County profile, which says the ages of buildings in Arlington, you will see that in the Columbia Pike corridor, we had almost zero redevelopment in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We had the oldest commercial building stock in the county. And then you will see that in 2000s and 2010, there has been quite a bit of redevelopment. And that's been good. I was very committed when I started this job to never talk about the streetcar, because when I started, everybody said, "Well, are you going to bring the streetcar back?" Because that is what most people who don't live on the Pike know about Columbia Pike, was that there was going to be a streetcar back in 2010, 2015, and it was canceled in 2015. That was a core tenet, a core founding kind of driver of some of that redevelopment, not necessarily in the form-based code, but in the economic development plan for the Pike. And that was 10 years ago. So some of that redevelopment and some of the momentum on the Pike has, I would say, stagnated, or at least reshuffled a bit, because of three things: the loss of the streetcar, COVID, and then hard to say exactly what the impact is, but as you know, there's major construction and redevelopment going on in the actual streetscape along Columbia Pike, which is basically deferred maintenance from when Virginia handed over ownership of Columbia Pike to Arlington County. And some of that was work that was intended to be done during the streetcar project, but since it wasn't done, it still had to be done. Undergrounding of utilities, replacing, because it's a very old corridor, replacing infrastructure that had not been replaced in 50 to 75 years. So, but that has been, all three of those things have been significant interruptions to the progress of the Pike. And the same thing happened with the organization that I'm running, right? It started with $50,000 in 1986. We kind of languished in that 100% dependent on county funding until about 5 or 6 years ago. And since then, we've grown the funding. So let me just, including additional private funding. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Columbia Pike Partnership at its moment, right? So my assumption is that you've heard of the Roslyn bid or Roslyn and National Landing in Boston. They are all operating under bids, business improvement districts. There's a number of business improvement districts in the city, and they are generally relatively well funded, and they are all funded on a special additional tax levied on property owners in that district in exchange for additional services, whether it's trash pickup, beautification, community engagement activities, things like that. There are three bids in Arlington: the Ballston, Roslyn, and National Landing. Their budgets range from about 5 million at National Landing and Roslyn, at least, to about $1.5 million at Ballston, based on the size of the land. And it's only the landlords and the property owners that are taxed, and it's only commercial, based on the size of the district and the number of properties and the valuation of those properties and their tax rates, et cetera. Alternatively, you have three partnerships or alliances in Arlington. I'm sure you know them all: Clarendon, Langston Boulevard, and Columbia Pike. We are built on the Main Street model. Main streets are all over the United States. It was a program that kind of started in more rural or rural parts of the country, and now has expanded into suburban areas. The District of Columbia has 7 main streets, and Arlington, like I said, has 3. We are directly funded through the county, and that is historically the model, that they are funded around the country through economic development or chambers of commerces, with more of an emphasis on private funding. Decisions that were made before I started was to expand Columbia Pike beyond the resources that are provided by Arlington County, $400,000 a year. And so now, unlike any other of the bids or the partnerships in the county, I'm raising about 40% of our budget every year from businesses and individuals. And that is hard, as Wendy can tell you. It is not fun, or anybody else who's ever been involved with a fundraiser or who has gotten about 30 to 50 pieces of mail at the holidays. It is not fun. But it's important for our mission. So over time, the partnership CPRO has evolved its mission. I would say my assumption, although I was not here, maybe Pax or others can say, that prior to the adoption of the plan, the form-based code, the streetcar, it was really advocating and convening and getting public support and public alignment for those projects and plans. I think it's kind of like, what does the architect do after the house is built? And I think there has been some level of a repurposing, and I'm still trying to figure this out, but because of COVID, because of the streetcar, because of some staff turnover at the leadership level, Takis Karantonis was one of my predecessor 3 people ago. He left in 2016. There was an interim for 3 years. Then my predecessor, Kim Klingler, was there for 4 years, primarily during COVID. So when I came in, I sensed that there wasn't necessarily a clear understanding and an ability to articulate that understanding about what we were doing in the community, why we were doing it in the community, and who we were doing it for, was very clear. In addition to trying to understand the finances, the fundraising, and like any other nonprofit, just the in-house operations and the governance. So I would say that those were kind of my first year tasks: figuring out the governance, figuring out the funding, figuring out why we existed, who we existed for, and what we were doing in pursuit of that mission, right? And I think and it was a big contrast for me, right? Because when I came from Arlington Thrive, we did emergency financial assistance. We were measured on how many people we were able to prevent from eviction. That is a very clear metric. And it was very funding specific. If I got $1 million, I could help this many people. If I got 2 million, we knew what our average assistance was, and it was very linear. There's nothing linear about Columbia Pike, and it is a very important part of the county's story. And I probably short shrifted a little bit about what makes the Pike so special, but I can talk about that in a minute. And I'm going to try to wrap this up in about 5 minutes. So then we'll have a few minutes for questions. So when I came in, like I said, what is the why? Who are our stakeholders, or who are we serving? And then what are we doing in pursuit of that service, right? Or to fulfill that mission. The mission is pretty straightforward. You know, we envision a Columbia Pike that is welcoming, thriving, supportive of all who live and work there, live, work, and visit there. That's not the exact word for word. I mean, I think Steve put the website up. You can see it word for word. Same thing with the mission. We aim to support that vision. We aim to support that mission through our activities of being the convening and leading body on the Pike, which is, and I can talk about that in a minute, which is challenging when you have a small team and a small budget, but people want you to be all things to all people, including me. I want to be all things to all people. But let's just say that I had a clear sense, okay, that's our mission. We're supposed to support the businesses, the individual, the residents, and help really the community thrive. But that really is somewhat perfunctory or insufficient when you say, okay, so who are the businesses and who are the residents? What I found, and I'm sure you've heard other nonprofit leaders say this, and you've probably experienced this because you all have lived in Arlington and you live in a pretty, let's just say, aware community, is that when we talk about residents, remember 80% of the residents are living in multifamily housing. 60% of them are non-white. Well, it was my assessment based on who was on the board, who we were engaging with, that most of the programming and messaging and communicating, et cetera, was being directed towards the 10 to 20% of people who were living in single-family homes off of the Pike. And so that was bringing the renters into a focus of being one of our core stakeholders was one of the, I think, an important thing that we've done over the last year. Because I would say that we have two primary stakeholders, residents and then businesses. And then we talk about businesses and we get a lot of kudos and we do a lot for small business support, legacy business preservation, making sure that these restaurants are able to hold on, doing what we can to help them interact with the county, et cetera. But what about business development and business support for businesses that want to come to the Pike? Whether that should or shouldn't be one of our goals, I think it's important because we get 60% of our budget from the county, and what they are trying to do is increase and maintain tax revenue. So I want to be a part of that. So how can we be a more active player in business development and creating an attractive place for both existing and future businesses? On the other hand, we also have partners. I consider the Arlington County a key partner. And then we have obviously the civic associations, the Chamber of Commerce, the many nonprofits like Phoenix Bikes or the Free Clinic or others who operate on the Pike. I think when I was at Thrive, and I know at AFAC, that about 50 to 60% of all need for the social services nonprofits come from the area code 22204, which is not exactly synonymous with the Pike, but it's close enough that it gives you a very good sense. Because it's basically the Pike. So then what are we doing and how do we do it? And I will say that, again, it wasn't clear to me exactly how we identified our program when I started. And some of this I've learned from being on the job a year. Some of us I learned from being educated by Main Street America and other organizations. And some of it we've kind of reverse engineered and said, okay, we're doing these things. What do we call all of these things that we're doing? So I think we do programming in three primary areas: supporting our businesses, both existing and future; community engagement, which is the festivals, the lunches, this would be a great example of a community engagement opportunity to get people together, to convene them. And then the third one is placemaking, the physical manifestation of our vision and our community, right? And whether that's public art, wayfinding, signage, we'll talk about parking signs in a minute, or things like that. It's how do we really live and represent our vision? And I would say that when I started, we were doing really well in the community engagement and on the small business support, but really had not done much on placemaking, which is hard when you have a lot of this construction going on. And we hadn't really been doing as much on business development. And I think we were leaving some things off the table. We have the oldest, I think the longest running farmers market, and definitely the only year-round longest running farmers market in the county. And most people don't know about it. It's not been well marketed. We don't have enough vendors. So how do we use that as a brand leader for the Pike and for all the things that we believe that we represent? We also have two other areas that we focus on, and that maybe I'll close on this. One is advocacy, advocating for policies like the Form-Based Code or Form-Based Code 2.0 or whatever may come next, advocating for our residents through the civic associations. And then there's also like a customer service component, like, okay, well, this street light's been out for 2 weeks. The county's not returning our calls. Great. Well, I can pick up and I can call somebody at transportation or planning, et cetera, and try to lubricate that issue. And we do the same thing with the businesses, right? Last week, I was with 2 members of the county board, about 15 small businesses, and staff leadership of all the different, or of the most relevant departments. And so we're trying to do more on the advocacy and business engage and the business advocacy side. And then the last one is really helping tell the Pike story. Columbia Pike, CPRO rebranded as CPP, Columbia Pike Partnership, in 2021. But what they didn't include in that was, what is the Pike story? What is the Pike brand? What is the Pike essence? And it really does come down to a few very special things that I am really happy and proud to be a part of. And when we talk about the Pike, we talk about a community that is welcoming and that is inclusive. And obviously, some of these words are not as popular as they were perhaps a few months ago, but they are still important to us. And we believe, I'm just pulling up my language here to get this right, let's see if I succeed or not. But that we believe that the Pike is really a distinct place, and it's distinct because of our sense of community, because of our inclusiveness, our cultural diversity, and our focus on deliberate and intentional growth through the Form-Based Code, and being really proud and protective of our existing businesses. And that, is very exciting and important to me as we tell that Pike story, whether it's in all the ways that we, that I've shared thus far. So it's a pretty special place, and it's a place that I've come to know and feel very protective of, and very eager to really take it to not only the prominence that it deserves, but also to make sure that we continue to do everything we can with the resources that we have. I talked recently to a peer who is the head of Frederick, Maryland, Main Street, and she has a staff slightly bigger than mine, but they're doing about 3 times as many events, and they have a volunteer program, and they have ways that they are connecting with the community that we're not there yet. So I think that how do we get there as well is really what I'm focusing on. But we really want to make sure that we are continuing, even in this day and age, and maybe even more importantly, that we continue to be a welcoming place where we are celebrating both our similarities and our differences, and that we continue to make it those things for both our current residents and businesses and for future residents and businesses. So I think that's about what I have to say about that. And I would love to answer all the questions. I saw that there was at least 1 or 2 questions in the chat. So I can either address those first, or all of you who are waving and jumping up and down.
I don't see any hands up, so why don't you address the ones in the chat?
So I think, Pax has a question in the chat about parking, and I think it has been shocking to me, and it's a top priority for me when we talk about signage and parking on the Pike. And let me just say, I think Clint Eastwood many years ago ran for the mayor of Carmel, California, or maybe it was Carmel by the Sea, because he wanted to put a sign up for a restaurant that he owned. and he couldn't get it up. And so that's why he ran for mayor. And I understand the frustration because we have a very onerous and somewhat restrictive signage policy in the county that works against other interests of the counties. And this is a well-documented and known fact, and yet it persists. And so I have just kind of started to crack that nut about how we can improve signage for things include parking amongst them on the Pike. And it is shocking to me. But if you are in zoning or in permitting and your job is to make sure that you are enforcing the signage code, then that is your job. Your job is not economic development and supporting businesses. So somebody else has to say, hey, you also have to take these things into consideration, or how do we not? So I'm funded by the county, and I'm basically trying to negotiate or broker alignment between different aspects of the county. So you have three people being paid from three different perspectives to try to get something that is ultimately in the best interest and the goals of the county, which is to support our businesses, grow the economy, and yes, adhere to code. We don't want to look like an unregulated, and that's part of the reason why we have a successful county. But I think that's just a fascinating public policy example, because to your point, I think embedded in there, Pax, is that there is, I believe, sufficient public parking on the Pike. There are several garage lots that are either low cost or I don't know if any of them are free, but we hide them and we do not celebrate them. Let me just say one other thing about transportation really quickly, even though it's not really the question, because one of the things, like when you talk about advocacy, is that Columbia Pike has one of the best east to west, Fairfax to DC bus routes in the region, really. I mean, we get it done. It's almost like being in New York City. You can be out there, you don't have to check the app, you can get on a bus and you can be on a bus in about 3 to 5 minutes. What we have is a disparity in our north-south connectivity on public transportation. And so if you live on the Pike, or if you live in Ballston or Courthouse and you want to come to the Pike, it could take you 45 minutes to take public transportation, either through ART or Wilmot or through Metro Bus. And so how do I get that change where people see the value of integrating and connecting Northern Arlington with South Arlington, our transportation hubs of Ballston, Roslyn, Pentagon City, places like that has been, I haven't done anything on it yet. Just it's only been a year. Give me a break. Cut me some slack. But I think it's fascinating. I believe, and I could be totally wrong, and I know I should be cognizant of the day and age that I'm saying this, and that this is all because of systemic desire to keep parts of the Pike separate from, or parts of the community separated, segregated from other parts of the community. Not that we have those intentions now, but these legacy systems and these legacy routes, these thoroughfares still exist. And I think that there are things that we can do to be more inclusive on that. But getting people to change bus routes because Andrew Schneider says so has not really been an effective strategy in the past. So we have to find a different way to do that. So, and then there was a question. Was there another question? There was
Well,
another
there's a
question.
comment here about all of the things that have, the Arlington Mill used to be a
Yeah.
Safeway. Lady Hamilton went away when Penrose was developed.
Yeah.
What do you see in the way of commercial development that's coming, unintended, coming down the pike in the near
Yeah.
future?
I would say I would say I use that pun unintentionally about 5 to 10 times a week. So I think you're in good hand. You're in good company there. I think it's hit and miss, right? Because here's the thing. Yes, younger people who have money, but there's other people who don't. And also if we want to make it accessible for people who are aging in place and want to come to dinner on the Pike, like my parents, and maybe they can drive now, but what if we want people, what if they're living at the Jefferson, or what if they're living at other places? And yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, because my dad's 78, 79, and I'm trying to get him to stop just calling Red Top and also use Uber. So that's a whole nother conversation. But sorry, I didn't mean to digress. But what I've learned in my year or so on the Pike, I didn't know anything about urban planning. I knew very little about commercial real estate, and I knew very little about placemaking. I would say the things that I've learned about commercial real estate is that it's fascinating because the timelines and the scales are so different. Like I was talking about at Thrive, day metrics versus commercial real estate can be decade metrics, right? And so what's fascinating is that you need to have macroeconomic interest rates, things like that. You need to have microeconomic, okay, what is the going rate for office space or square footage retail space? And then emotional alignment, right? I've owned this building. My parents bought this building. This building generates $50,000 a year in revenue for me and my 16 cousins, and we don't want to sell. You know, all of those things have to align for us to decide to sell this building, to build this building, and then redevelop it. I will say that there's, and you probably know this if you're ever on the Pike, that there is a terrible situation right at the corner, a little bit in from Walter Reed and Columbia Pike at the Penrose area, the Fillmore Shopping Center, which was originally like the Salsa Room, Attila's. There's a couple of other smaller businesses there. It's been vacant for 4 or 5 years with the hope that it was going to be redeveloped. That the redevelopment fell through. And now the owners, the family, are trying desperately, and I think that they're going to be successful in 2025, knock on wood, to redevelopment. But that's challenging, and because that's been completely vacant. Not as bad, but similar. You look at like the ECDC building, which is owned by the Ethiopian Community Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit. The ECDC might be a holding company, but the holding company might own the building. But nonetheless, for them to redevelop and work with the county and get the funding for that and be able to do the things that they have to do and the money that they think that they should earn when 5 years ago they couldn't have earned X, and now you're earning 0.7X, while that building is 80% vacant, incentivizing somebody to redevelop that project is really challenging. But I think if you look at the redevelopment on the Pike, the form-based code did work. There has been a lot of redevelopment. What I ask is, for the projects that have not been redeveloped, is the form-based code the best way to still, for the parcels that have not been is the form-based code still the best way to incentivize the remaining parcels to continue to redevelop? And not that everything should be redeveloped, but it's not, and this is the same thing with a lot of historic preservation. A lot of the decisions about whether something was historically preservable were made decades ago, and they've either been totally bastardized or come into complete ruin. So trying to determine what is worth saving. I'm not saying just tear it all down, but I am saying if something looks crappy, doesn't have businesses in it, and isn't, best use of the parcel, could we do something else there? And how do we incentivize the owners to do that? Just like, can we incentivize owners of new properties to fill their vacant office space? Or their vacant retail space. And so it's a multi-pronged strategy. So that's what I would say about that. And if there's anybody on the historic preservation crowd here, I'm not trying to pick a fight.
Excuse me.
Cheryl's got a comment that A&V has a program called Community Ambassadors that recruits older adults who educate other older residents about aging-related services in Arlington. Can you see a way that A&V could work with the Columbia Pike Partnership to identify community ambassadors who can reach out and educate older residents along the Pike?
I think this is perfect alignment between our community engagement efforts, especially focusing on some of our, if not marginalized, but overlooked populations over the years. And so I think it's a perfect thing. I think the first thing would do is is to hear a little bit more about the program, maybe think about what works well with other programs, because I think there are people out there as a community ambassadors that we could recruit. I think the other thing is to be thinking about who are your A&V members, both on the community side and the people who are benefiting from your services, that we could also kind of talk to. So Cheryl, I know that a number of people on this call have my email, so that's a good conversation to have. There is going to be a new
And what I was going to say, Andy, is they've got this kind of community ambassador program in Alexandria, in Fairfax County, and Loudoun County, and it just got set up about a year or so ago. And a woman named Michelle McMahon is the person who runs the Community Ambassador Program in connection with Arlington Neighborhood Village. And needless to say, they're trying to reach out to all of the communities within Arlington, and especially if there's some issue pertaining to language. And so a lot of people sometimes don't even know what the county has to offer. And so these community ambassadors are designated to be educated about the various services that are in Arlington and reach out, whether it's going to a beauty shop or a barber shop or some kind of an apartment building where older residents live. But Columbia Pike, I'm sure there's a lot of older adults on the Pike as well. And I just wanted to make that connection. And whatever I can do, you can either write to me and I'll get in touch with, but you said you know Wendy quite well. But I would strongly advise that you get in touch with Wendy and ask her, who to talk with in terms of the Community Ambassador Program.
Thanks. There's a question about the fire station at Carlin Springs. I'm just trying. My understanding is that, and I'm still learning the geography, that there is slated to be a new fire station on the Pike. My only relative sense of scale is that it's going to be closer to the west end of the Pike towards where the Serrano Apartments is, which I don't know the exact cross streets, but it's past Glebe, past Arlington Mill, up the hill. So that's what I know about that. I don't know, and I don't know the timeline for that either. And actually, Nancy, I keep on saying that these are PAX questions, but my guess are probably all yours because these are good. Sorry, PAX. So, all right.
You had mentioned outreach things like festivals. I'm familiar with the Blues Festival. Can you just briefly let us know what other major public events like that are on the calendar for this year?
Yeah, we do a monthly lunch, which would be great because it seems like a lot of the people who tend to come are folks who have either flexible work schedules or are not working full time. That we do pick a different restaurant every month on the Pike. It's pay as you go. We ask that you sign up. The next one is March 26th at Sabora's, which is on the Pike. It's tapas and it's kind of fusion, but it's mostly tapas, and it's great. I think I'm having lunch there today in about an hour, and we do a monthly happy hour. We've only had one, so I cannot tell you the exact vibe of those. I think the next one is at William Jeffries, but I'm not sure, and I think it's next week, so I should know, huh? And what else? We do the festival that you mentioned in June. We support Hispanic Heritage Festival in September. We do a Paws, P-A-W-S, Paws on the Pike in October related to pet owners. And we are trying, and I feel like need to be expanding our offerings through the year. We do movies every Friday and Saturday night, outdoor movies in the summer at Arlington Mill at Penrose Square. So those are some of the things we do. I think what we're also thinking about doing is what are some other community engagement things we can do. I do have a staff of when I started, it was a staff of 4. I'm down to a staff of 2, but we're about to hire for a community engagement outreach person, which would be somebody that would be kind of helping me manage some of these events. We do have, I believe that there's a community calendar. We definitely have a weekly newsletter that goes out once once a week. And if you just go to that website, columbiapike.org, you can sign up there. And that's probably the best way. And we try to get our things in RL Now and stuff, but I will say that there's just a lot of things that I felt like needed to be done when I got there, as anybody who's ever run things, and I'm sure everybody feels that, because there's always a closet you don't look into, and even if people are the most organized people in the world. So I'm still just looking through some of our closets, figuring out what still has to be done. So I hope you can find those events, but for right now, the best way to sign up for them is the newsletter.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. Gary, have you anything else? Otherwise, we'll.
No, I Jim had asked about, is there a calendar and how do you sign up? And Andrew just answered that. So I think we're all caught
Okay.
up.
Okay.
Did anybody fall asleep? There's about 11 people who are not on camera. I just can't. I'm just assuming we're at least 50-50 kept awake, so I'm
We're
very
still here,
happy.
Andrew. We're still here
Right.
and we're still
So,
awake. So,
oh,
excellent program.
all
So,
right. Well, I hope this was good. I would love to do it anytime. I love to talk. I love to talk to ANV. I love all the things that you're doing. So keep on doing them. And if you see any of those miscreants that I mentioned earlier, you can tell them I said hi.
okay. And if you have any questions about the Community Ambassador Program and you can't reach Wendy, just reach out to me on the Aging Matters website, or you probably have my email address. So get in touch. So
My advice on that, just to be very candid, is that it's probably best if you or whoever else was on that group email that I was on just tags up with Wendy and say, hey, can you connect him with Michelle or whatever? Because if not, then I could lose the beat and we would miss that opportunity. So
well,
if somebody would do that,
I'll
mm,
remind Wendy as well. So
okay, that would be great. That'd be great.
okay.
All right.
So, well, thank
All
you,
right.
everybody. It's 11:02. We want to thank Andrew Schneider for an update on the Columbia Pike partnership, and be sure and join us again next week. Next week, the topic is Casa Meriflor, which is talking a lot about things pertaining to Latin immigrants and services in connection with COVID. So there might be more here. So you might want to look on the update, the community update about next week's program. So Casa Meriflor. And with that, have a good week, and we'll see you next Wednesday at 10 o'clock.